about the building of bilingual services. And I hear your community of practice is dedicated to this work, so I'm very excited to share learnings with you today. First, who am I? I'm a francophone from the province of Quebec in Canada. I am not born bilingual. I actually became bilingual during my early university studies. I was enrolled in an English studying Earth, and I even carried part of my research in UK at the Open University. My passion has always been about language and communication, especially making complex concepts understandable and building connections between disciplines. It's pretty much what I've been doing even as a science researcher, where I was interested in bridging the gap between geology and geophysics, which we could respectively describe as a hands-on science and a theoretical science. It was something nobody has done before, so it was pretty cool. For the past 6 years, I've been working as a language professional at various places, including the World Intellectual Property Office. And currently I'm a content designer at the Canadian Digital Service. I started there as an English to French translator, and I slowly transitioned into content design. Highlights of my time at CDS include working on the Canadian COVID app, and another thing I'm proud of is literally the subject of this presentation. Although an undertaking such as designing bilingual services is far from being the work of a single person. So today we're going to talk about the Canadian context, our learnings towards building a bilingual process, examples of bilingual design, thoughts about mental models, needs, and design principles in a bilingual context, and language patterns that impact implementation. All right, let's go. The Canadian context. Canada has 2 official languages, English and French. 75.4% of the population has English as their first official language spoken, and 22.8% of the population has French as the first official language spoken. Canada is divided into several provinces and territories, and some have 1 or more official languages, and some don't at all, but most of them speak English. Quebec is the only province to have French as official language, and New Brunswick has both languages as official languages. So French is mostly spoken in these 2 provinces, although there are French communities everywhere in Canada. At the federal level, we have an Official Languages Act, which states that all federal public services and communications must be offered in both English and French. And the policy on how to implement this mentions that these services and communications should respect a principle of substantive equality between English and French. What happens is that the distribution of languages we just saw is also reflected in the public service. So there are many more people speaking English, and their working language is mostly English by default. So the direction of translation is mostly or pretty much always English to French. And this even makes people say that in the public service, French is not an original language, it's a translated language. So there's some thinking to do about the equality part there. And with English being the default working language, the requirement from the Official Languages Act is often perceived as a box to check before publishing something. So I'm sure you see me coming with this, and you may find yourself in a similar situation where Welsh becomes an afterthought. A pretty strong example of how this has occurred at CDS is this translation request. Can you understand what's there? If yes, the chances are high that you're a developer. So when we forked the code for the Notify product from gov.uk, of course, we weren't in a position to do bilingual design from the start. We started with a decent service, all in one language, but we had to make it bilingual for our context. So the screenshot here is the type of document that our translation services would receive. It's just the translation strings pulled from the code. There's no context whatsoever. And moreover, you have strings that have one word from a whole sentence, and you don't know what sentence. So you can only imagine the time it takes to review such a translation. On other product themes, the situation was far from being as bad, but it wasn't ideal either. The process generally looked like this. So the team would do a unilingual discovery. I believe this happened mainly because the team members were predominantly English speakers, and the team dynamics is much easier when we're all dealing with the same language. And it's something even I, as a French-speaking person, need to be careful about. Then the content designer would work on the English content. And during this step, there are normally team reviews or ongoing communication with subject matter experts. So the content designer benefits from receiving feedback as they go. When the team had agreed an iteration or version was ready, they'd reach out to me or send everything to the Federal Translation Services. And when this happened, I would focus on reviewing the translation. At this step, the English content was often coded since it had been confirmed. And then there would be this wonderful translation phase, which wasn't simple because we're dealing with public services, which means that the content is 100% functional. So the translation really is an act of communication focused on an objective. And the questions are, who are we writing for? And what should people be able to achieve with the translated content? So to produce a good translation, there were many things I had to know about the readership. I would ask questions to the content designer to better understand the context. I would raise ambiguities, and we would enter into this sort of feedback loop. And this feedback loop is important, but it requires time. And the reality was that at this stage, we were often under a tight time constraint. The English was already coded. We'd lose track of the source of truth, these sort of things. In addition to these issues that I would describe as more operational, there are a lot of questions I started asking myself. How could I know if the French speakers had the same mental model as the English speakers? How could I know if the needs of a minority culture were the same as the ones of the majority culture? How could I be sure that the English content design principles could be applied similarly to French content? Ultimately, how could I be confident that the French product was indeed respecting the principle of substantive equality to the English product? So the reality is that we couldn't really, and this was the problem. Of course, all the previous questions pointed to the same need, bringing French considerations earlier in the process. The problem of translation being an afterthought is not a new problem. I'm far from being the only one who noticed the imbalance this creates between the two languages. And when we think about it, there are several people involved in the creation of the English content. The content designer, the subject matter experts, the researchers, the other designers, and of course the users. And the translation needs to benefit from the same input. And this input starts by carrying research about both language populations as well as testing in both languages. This is what allows us to answer questions about the user's mental models and needs. And the research process is not really different. You always start with a question or assumptions you want to verify. The only thing that you need to do is to represent the different language populations equally in research, ideally based on the distribution of these languages in the larger population. So the idea is to avoid unequal representation of issues and unequal representation of priorities of things to fix. And as one of our researchers says, research isn't useful when insights are not representative. Over the years, there are a couple of tips we collected for carrying bilingual research and testing. One of them is take time to do terminology research in both languages at the start of discovery. So when you're starting on a project, be intentional about recruiting participants in both languages. At CDS, it happens that only English speakers will sign up for a research session. And it's really easy to say, well, we tried. But you can also send reminders or, make additional recruitment efforts. It's worth it. It's necessary, in fact. Then plan for translation. So make sure all testing material is translated, and this includes the facilitating guides. The idea is to make the research process accessible to all people on your team. If you're doing intercept testing, having signs and stands in both languages really helps attract both populations. Invite the translator to your research sessions as an observer or note taker. This is invaluable context for them. And finally, take notes in the native language of the users. This is super important if you want to be able to inform your design decisions. It happened to me several times to learn or to see after the fact that the notes from a French session had been translated on the fly into English. So, all potential data about language nuances would be lost. Now, I don't know what's the working language in your team. At CDS 2 years ago, there were not enough French-speaking people to form a product team that could design in French from scratch. Even if we've had, it may not have been ideal either, because then we'd just have reversed the translation direction. No matter what the language transaction, it's inevitable. So the big question is, when should we translate? And what we found worked best was to start working on the French content when an initial draft was ready in English. The idea is to recreate this feedback loop earlier in the process, after you've done a bilingual discovery. I love how Dominique Joseph, a specialist in clear communication, who's also a French translator, summarizes the same process. It means using the translation not as a final version, but as a starting point. The most important is that we end up having two writing processes, one in English and one in the other language, which can both evolve based on new learnings in each language. And this early bilingual work offers benefits. Since the English content is just the first draft, it prevents designers to get too attached to the content. It makes it possible to rework the design principles if needed. It helps solve the problem of version tracking and source of truth, because we're working on both drafts pretty much at the same time. Nothing is coded until both English and French are ready. And finally, it gives time to both English and French writers to get the feedback they need. All right, this is an example of how we do that concretely. In this case, we were doing a round of design changes on the Notify product after user testing. So this is in Figma. We have the English and French side by side, or sometimes one above the other. And I find it works great because everything is done in context. We can document the decisions and have them available to both French and English designers. And having both languages at the same place also makes it easier to get feedback during content critiques. Again, just another example from the COVID Alert project. The English and French are side by side, and it's easy to comment on both designs to get contextual information if needed, when needed. So really, all the feedback loop is made possible right in there, and that's what's amazing. Here's another example of how the feedback loop is beneficial to both languages. This is from our work on the COVID Alert app. And we were working on adding a QR code feature to the app. So you probably know how it works. You'd go to a place, scan a code, and get notified later if you've been exposed. In our early work on how to describe this new type of notification, the English draft was talking about place-based notification. Now, this is a bit hard to translate into French. There are many ways we can translate it nicely, but a good choice would distance itself from a literal translation. So there's a potential issue that arises when we think of mass communication. How would others translate it? We couldn't forget that this was a national tool. If news outlets were to translate it literally, we'd end up with something that is not in plain language in French, and more importantly, something that's called something different outside versus inside the app. So I did some vocabulary research in French, found out that this concept was more generally talked about in terms of exposure in public places that someone would visit. So where initially we were thinking of highlighting the new type of notification, we ended up highlighting the new type of exposure. I think we improved both English and French because conceptually, this was easier to contrast with the other type of exposure we already had in the app, close contact exposure. This is another example from the COVID Alert project. When someone was exposed to COVID, the public health would give them an alphanumeric code to enter into the app. This would then execute the notification of other people who've been in close contact. But the code was given over the phone, and it could be hard to understand the letters and numbers because of that. So a team member had the idea of using a phonetic alphabet to reduce the communication difficulties. And you're probably familiar with the NATO alphabet, which matches words to the sound of their first letter, like Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, etc. The thing is that these alphabets were created for a specific audience in a military context, and some of their words are not well understood today. So we started thinking about criteria for words that help identify letters, considering our very own bilingual and modern context. We developed shared principles for both languages. For example, we wanted words to be similar in French and English to make it easier to use with a bilingual population. We wanted words that are more likely to be familiar across cultures. We looked for words with at least 2 syllables because the second syllable could help make sure, like, it would support the first one and make sure you heard the right word. We needed also to think about how the words sound. So you can think of the letter C, which could be confused with K or S in words such as castle or city. And finally, we also wanted to avoid negative connotations. So this is just a few examples of words that we changed from the native alphabet using our principle. All right, so now I'd like to go back to the questions I shared earlier. So do we have the same mental models? I believe there are differences in some instances, although in general, my experience is that the English and French populations have a lot in common as Western cultures. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether you think it's the same with the Welsh culture. So there are two differences I believe I see. The first one is more about how we deal with reality. And I would talk about systemic or cultural differences. When we were working on the COVID Alert project, one major objective was that people would trust the app. Now, a systemic or cultural difference that exists between French and English speakers is their relationship to language. French has this particularity of having a regulatory body in charge of standardizing the language, which doesn't exist in English. At the same time, French being the language of a minority, it's closely tied to identity. So for a lot of people, the language needs to be protected, and having a standard helps doing so. So I knew that the correctness of language could be a vector of trust. And this meant finding the balance between using the correct way of saying something and the popular way of saying something, the more simple or common way of saying something. Another example between the two cultures is the two systems of law. So there's one system of law in Quebec and there's another one in the rest of the country. And to make sure both English and French populations can read and understand the concepts of the federal laws, no matter what's the law system in their province, the laws are written in parallel from the start in both languages. So I find this is a really good example of how different models need to be addressed in a bilingual context. And then the second type of differences I see is much more micro level. There's a lot we can learn from translation studies about how people perceive and translate reality. In general, English relies more on sensorial distinctions, whereas French relies more on conceptual distinctions. A popular example is firewood in English, which can be translated by wood for heating in French, like bois de chauffage. For me, these differences probably mostly come when writing or translating plain language. You know, sometimes it's tricky to translate plain English because the English has already gone through an assessment of what's implicit enough to be removed and what the user's expectations are as part of their mental representation. So the same exercise needs to be done in the translated language. And these differences are helpful, or at least I find so. All right, second question we had was, do both language populations have the same needs? So they probably share most of the same needs, but you can't be sure unless you do research. And there might also be different constraints that you need to work with. The very first version of the QR code poster for COVID Alert looked like this one on the left. We had both languages on the same poster. And in interviews with users, it was mentioned by French-speaking participants that the French heading, this one, should be displayed before English. It's in fact a requirement for official languages in Quebec. and users care about this nuance. Later in testing, we learned more about users' misconceptions and needs, which were shared between both language populations. We added the steps on how to scan a code, and we ended up having 2 unilingual posters instead of 1 bilingual to make it easier to read, since alternating between French and English was very confusing with this much information. At CDS, we have a newsletter, one in English and one in French. And a few years ago, the engagement was much lower in French. So we carried research to understand why. And we mostly assumed it was due to the general lack of translation quality in the federal government, which often discourages French speakers to engage from engaging with French content. So our research did confirm this, but we also learned that the most prevalent problem was a lack of findability and awareness for the French newsletter. The subscribing process for the newsletter is based on the website language. So when you're on our English website and you subscribe, you'd automatically subscribe to the English newsletter and vice versa in French. So most people just didn't know. Other than that, the French readership said that the French content often lacks the concision of the English, and they're also more familiar with the English technical terms and not the French. So here's just a screenshot of, we added a link in the newsletter. So the French readership could then see that the French newsletter existed and they could see it. Okay, can we use the same content design principles? My take on this one is that yes, the big principles are the same, but I'm wary of ready-made solutions that are quite language focused, such as good services are verbs. The reasoning behind this statement is very sound. You know, services should reflect the activity that needs to be done by the public, and it should not reflect the government structure or process behind it. I've seen this applied several times to name services at CDS, and it's just that it doesn't work as well in French. That's why for the Notify product, we ended up having a verb, well, we just kept the name, GC Notify in English, and we have a noun in French. In general, I find that verbs in French are either too strong or too weak, because each verb tense has its own form. So you can either feel like you're being given an order or like the action isn't connected to anything concrete. Nominalizations, on the other hand, they represent the action, so it's more concrete. Okay, for the last part of the presentation, I'd like to share specific learnings that are more about implementation. So there are language patterns that impact the design and development. And it's good to share them with your team, share them widely with your organization once you've documented them. This came as a surprise to me. I probably thought it was more obvious than it is in reality. But I did a couple of presentations on this, and each time several people asked for the slides. So being aware of these patterns is a step towards building bilingual services from the start, because it can avoid designers and developers to redo their work. So here are some in French, but they may apply into other languages. So there are some patterns that impact the variable content in your code. Grammatical gender is one of them. And from what I've read, I think words also have a grammatical gender in Welsh. So in this example, name and postal address can both be introduced by the article a. However, these two words have a different grammatical gender in French, so the article needs to match this grammatical gender. So it creates a problem with the first part of the sentence. There's no, a single translation cannot exist in this case. This one is pretty much, it has the same consequences as the one we just saw. So articles in general are much simpler in English. And I won't go into French details here, but the thing to remember is that if you have more article options in one language, then it will cause problems with your variable content. I believe in Welsh you do have different articles for the English article the, depending on whether it's preceding a vowel or consonant. So yeah, you end up in a weird spot where you can't put the article outside the brackets, so in the main sentence, because it's not the same for each conditional variables. But putting the article inside your bracket may make this variable unusable elsewhere in your code. The structure of sentences, or the word order, can vary, and it can also affect variable content. I just made up an example here, but you can see that we can't just pull a variable and plug it into the sentence, because in French, the two options, so you have always, never, which are at the same place in the sentence in English, and they are not in French. They modify the sentence structure. We also have patterns that impact visual design. Typographic conventions are one of them. In French, the $sign follows the number, whereas in English it precedes it. So it's hardly a problem, except when you make this part of your visual design, like this example. Another thing that impacts the visual design is text expansion. We would think it's common sense, but I've been surprised how easy it is to forget about it. The first type of text expansion is that you have more words in one language than the other. I don't know what's the expansion factor from English to Welsh. I tried to find it, couldn't, but it's something to consider. If you start designing in one language in particular, you may end up with unpleasant surprises where your content doesn't fit anymore, or it doesn't flow right with your images. The second type I see is word expansion. So you have more letters in words in one language than the other. Now, the impact is that you have more text wrapping. And the impact is bigger if you're working with narrow screens, such as in a mobile app. And here you can see that even if I have less words, I have more text wrapping because words are longer. All right. When we started diving more into our challenges and blockers a couple years ago, we were picturing a future where product teams can work in both languages. So having Francophones on the team can help make research and iteration happen in French first as well. The translator or a French content designer are part of the process. So pair writing is made possible. So pair writing is made possible, and both versions benefit from the feedback loop. We avoid the pressure of last-minute translation. So yeah. And then tangible insights from research and testing are applied in French or Welsh, so that cultural and language nuances can be discovered and considered in the design. And finally, that everyone is thinking about both languages at every stage. I really see, for me, bilingualism is like accessibility, in that language can be a barrier. So ideally, we'd get to a point where everybody is intentional about it and consider bilingual implications. All right, so this is an invitation to connect with other bilingual designers. They're happy to connect with you as well. They're super thoughtful people. And I thank you very much, and I'm happy to share other learnings, hear what your thoughts are, and hear your questions, of course.
Thanks very much, Elise. Merci bien. I see a lot of parallels between what you said and experiences we've had in Wales. So on the call, we have content designers, UI specialists, accessibility specialists, Welsh language officers, Welsh policy officers. And if all those people who have questions could raise their hands in the team chat, then I'll take some questions from them and feed. There was a lot. So we have one at the moment from Mafanu Jones, Carmarthenshire County Council. Mafanu, beth yw dy gwestiwn di, Elise?
Hi Elise, thanks for that. It's really interesting to see another bilingual context and compare the attitudes and so on towards both languages. I was just interested, really fascinated by the fact that you pay a lot of attention to the different cultural nuances between the two populations or the two sectors of the population. And it struck me that we don't, or at least I don't think we consider those differences as much when we think about the way we communicate with both elements of the community or the population. I was wondering whether that was possibly because we don't have any monolingual Welsh speakers, whereas I think you even mentioned you yourself were monolingual French until fairly recently. So I just wonder whether you agree that that's probably why. And yeah, it's just a comment really, in that I think maybe we should think a bit more about it in terms of the way we communicate our public services and so on, considering the cultural, because there are massive cultural differences between the Welsh speaking population and the non-Welsh speaking population in Wales, but we maybe don't give it enough thought.
That's interesting. What you said about Welsh people not being monolingual. Yes, I think it does have a big impact. It makes it less of a barrier, I think. In Quebec, there are a lot of monolingual, French speakers. But it makes me think about like something I was wondering about Welsh culture and their relation to language, because I was picturing myself, using my phone or surfing on the web, and my browser is in French, my operating system is in French, so those are also things I need to consider to match the expectations of user. And I was wondering, I haven't seen my operating system that I could put in Welsh, so I think there is a difference that stems from what you just said. And as far for the cultural difference, maybe that's where your big impact lies. Because you just said there are big cultural differences, and maybe that's what is important for the Welsh people, even if they're comfortable with English. Maybe their comfort is bigger in one language than the other. I would love to read research about that.
Yeah, there's not a big pile of research that's been done on that particular thing. There are certain operating systems available in Welsh, but there are more systems with locales available in Welsh, not the full operating system. So that would automate a language choice. And there's a discussion to be had around how we get people to choose a Welsh language locale, so that does automate content provision in Welsh. Now on to Lee Jones, who has coordinated an awful lot of software localization into Welsh in Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, and blazed the trail really with user personas and things like that to look at what type of Welsh speakers like what type of content or not. And before I steal Lee's thunder too much, Lee, what's your question?
I'm just wondering, Elise, you mentioned obviously that one of the aspects is to actually develop the French and the English at the same time. But obviously there's a translation ask there, and how how difficult was that to sort of coordinate, and what kind of hints and tips you may have around that, really?
Yeah, didn't get time to get into more details around how this works. I said this is where we still have work to do. So as I said, I started as a translator there. So I was a bit like orbiting around all the teams. And the challenge was to have enough time to get all the context I needed. But as a content designer now, we do pair design, and we kind of experimented with a few models where you have two primary designer, one French and one English, who work together. They collaborate. This is more from an organization perspective, it's probably less efficient because it involves a lot of time and money as well, because you have two persons to do the work of that one you to do before. The other model is where you have one primary designer and a secondary designer, content designer. So the secondary designer will still attend, the meetings that are the most relevant to them, the research sessions, of course. The stand-ups are useful as well because it's an exchange of important information. But the strategic thinking is happens more in the job with the primary designer, and the secondary designer focuses more on, at the sentence or word level. So there's a less strategic thinking in this model.
So perhaps rather than a translator, you become a content designer that works with actually sort of writing the content.
Yeah, I believe the translator needs to have some knowledge about content design principles, and as long the way I see it is when you build something that is interactive, then there's a lot that can happen, and you need to consider a whole lot more than just like a web page, which is more static. So
I lead an internal translation team as part of the work that we do in HMRC, and it's quite a challenge to sort of keep up. If you're going to look at iterations on a real-time basis, we haven't got access to the design templates, or we literally get the words, and then we've come up with a process where we get screenshots to help the understanding, but it's clunky. It's really clunky. And then when you're looking at stuff that changes daily or something like that, it's very difficult to get that equality and same pace.
Oh yes, I've gone through that, so I know how it feels. You lose pieces, and the version tracking is hard to do. Yeah, that's why, like, when everything happens at one spot, like in Figma, for example, it's so much easier.
Sounds like it. Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you.
Sure, there's a lot of empathy on the call from Wales for lots of the points you've raised in your presentation and in that last question. Oes gan rhywun arall unrhyw beth i'w ofyn? Anyone else got anything they'd like to ask? I'll ask something then. So if you could tell us to do one thing which would start a transformation project for user experience. We're talking about lots of these things. I think we're still in the mode of content origination in one language, then sending to an unrelated translator and coming back. I think what would your one take home be for us?
Empower the translator. Yeah, more insights for them will help them do a better job. If you're stuck in this relationship of working with a translator from somewhere else, then yes, I'd say like try to bring them a bit closer to you. And that's where we started as well. And we were trying to this feedback loop. We were working towards a tighter feedback loop. We started with it was far, but then we just started to bring it closer. So I think that's what I would focus on.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Any other questions from colleagues in Wales? Unrhyw beth arall i'w fynd fan hyn? Edwina.
Jeremy, there's one from Helen who's having problems writing in the chat. It's around impact of this approach. So are you seeing results in terms of, people trusting and getting more people to use French services?
With the app, yes, we've heard great comments. It was good to see, it's very simple to use in French. Those are things that I wouldn't see before because the language was more governmenty and less user-focused. So I think, yes, it does make an impact. And the impact is not just on the user. Like, of course, we want it to be there, but knowing, in testing it works. And then once it's out in the world, at least we have the confidence that we've explored all the potential problems with this specific population.
Great, thank you. One last chance for questions o Gymru, unrhyw beth arall? Before I thank Elise. I see, I didn't have, sorry Helen, I didn't have access i'r sgwrs chwaith. I didn't have any access to the chat. So Elise, thank you very much. You've given us lots to think about. You've talked about mental models, and I don't think there's been much debate about that around content design and user experience in Wales, and lots of cultural aspects. So Ed, I think we've got a lot to talk about here and a lot to put into processes and a lot to put into the playbook for the CDPS, and then those guidelines can be followed throughout the whole of the public sector in time. But it's all good, and it's all just going to increase the quality of the user experience of Welsh speakers. So thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much.
If you want the slides, write to me and I can share them with you.
If you send them to Edwina, and then we can get them forwarded on. Thank you very much indeed. A note now for colleagues in Wales ynglyn â Microsoft Teams ar Gymraeg. I know lots of you have been really eager to know what's going on with Microsoft Teams and simultaneous human translation. And I know that because you've been emailing me over the last 2 years, and that's fair enough. So the closed circuit testing process has started, and 1 or 2 people on this call are part of that. We can't take it wider because you need special software, special access to special software, but it looks okay. At the moment, we're feeding back to Microsoft, and we're still on, at the moment, for a release date of a minimum viable product by the end of March. So hopefully by April, if I'm sharing one of these, I'll be able to do it entirely in Welsh, and you'll be able to hear an English language voice there. So Ed, would you like to make any other announcements about CDPS or anything?
Just to say the next meeting is going to be on the 3rd of March at 11 o'clock, so back to the normal time. So keep an eye out on the invite for that. And also interested in people's views on, Elise mentioned they're reaching out to other content designers. So is there any interest in maybe a community practice around content design specifically? Not sure what people think about that, so just drop me a line if you are. Thanks, Jeremy.
I think there would be. I think that would be a really valuable, and we can do it in Welsh and English, and the content of it can be about Welsh and English at the same time, and you bring those processes together then. Because I know when I've been drafting stuff in Welsh and I translate it to English, then I go back and translate and change the Welsh as well, and that's just a simple example of it. So, diolch yn fawr i chi gyd am ddod heddiw. Unrhyw gwestiynau i Elise, I chi'n gwybod le i gael gafel arni hi, and we'll see you next time. Diolch yn fawr.